This is a lecture from OpenTuition. To benefit from the lecture, you should download the free lecture notes from opentuition.com.
This chapter deals with the ethical code of CIMA, the code which members of CIMA and CIMA students are required to follow. CIMA has largely adopted the code that was produced by the IESBA, the International Ethics Standard Board for Accountants, which is a subcommittee of IFAC, the International Federations for Accountants. And what we have here, what is known as the 5 fundamental ethical principles, and you have to know these words and what they mean. And first of all, we have integrity. Now, many people think integrity we could just use the word honesty. No, you're really supposed to know the word integrity, because integrity is actually more than honesty. Integrity means, in addition to being honest, it means standing up for what you believe in. So if your boss comes along and says, could you change that cash flow so it becomes more favorable, and you think, well, that would be far too an optimistic cash flow, you are not exercising integrity if you change the cash flow to something you really don't believe in. That doesn't mean you couldn't be, with proper argument, persuaded that maybe it would be reasonable. Also, you can't be showing integrity if you choose not to look or not to investigate. So if you think there's something slightly odd going on with approving some invoices, and you kind of say, well, there's only one invoice, and maybe I didn't see it, and you kind of turn what we call a blind eye to what's happening, that is not acting with integrity either. Objectivity, to avoid bias, to deal with matters only looking at the relevant facts, if you like, when making a decision. Avoid conflict of interest, because that will tug you in one direction. Avoid other sorts of undue influence that might alter your opinion or your conclusions. Professional competence and due care. In other words, spend long enough to do something properly. Don't do something if you don't know how to do it, if you be guessing. It means staying up to date with accounting standards, for example. Confidentiality. As accountants, we are privileged to see all sorts of information which is highly confidential. You will see how the company's results are doing, maybe month by month, and before members of the public, maybe, but certainly before the shareholders will see what these results are. And for example, if you were to tell a relative, buy shares in this company because it's going to have some really good results, not only is that illegal because it is insider trading, it is unethical because you are breaking confidentiality rules. You also see maybe what people's salaries are, and that is confidential. You should only be breaking confidentiality rules if you're legally required to do so, as you might be, say, on suspicions of money laundering, or you have a right to do so, perhaps if you're having to defend actions or views which you took. And finally, professional behavior. You have to comply with the law. You have to avoid any action which brings the profession into disrepute or which discredits it. And here, honesty is very highly regarded as an essence of professional behavior. I can remember some years ago in London, an accountancy student was found guilty of not paying his underground fare of about £3. And it was found that he hadn't just forgotten to do it, or hadn't just forgotten his ticket. It was proved this person had deliberately tried not to pay £3 underground fare, found guilty in court, and then was banned by his accountancy body from ever being a member. Because why would you want an accountant who is willing to be dishonest? If you can't believe accountants are honest, then in a way you are eating away at what could be called a unique selling proposition. And in fact, if you break any of these ethical principles, you're undermining why accountants are valued. If you can't believe a cash flow that has been produced by an accountant, if you think they have been forced in some way, maybe through undue influence of a relative or a friend or a boss, to produce a cash flow which is really fictitious, how are you going to justify a good salary or a good charge-out rate if you can be believed no more than, in a way, anybody else? What we look at next is what's called the ethical framework. And the ethical framework says we have the 5 fundamental principles here, which we looked at: integrity, objectivity, confidentiality, professional competence and due care, professional behavior there. And we know that these principles are going to be subject to some threats. And what we need to do is to build in some safeguards. So this is the ethical framework, as it's called. So really it is saying if you are aware in advance of the possibility of some threats, then you might be able to avoid them entirely by not getting yourself into a difficult situation. That's really the ultimate safeguard. Or if the threat is still there, can we do something to reduce it to what's called an acceptable level? And things which might help us here, laws can help us, say, in insider trading. Laws can help us in money laundering and so on, as a threat coming in there perhaps. Monitoring people, our bosses monitoring what we do, monitoring our own behavior, training, internal controls, leadership from the top, so that we are given support by our bosses to act ethically. And then, of course, discipline, knowing that if you do something wrong, you may be punished, can be a powerful way of keeping you on the straight and narrow. And communication. People may be discussing ethical dilemmas which they've had, talking to you how they have perhaps solved those, and you begin to learn potentially what the threats are and maybe what one should do about those threats. Now, threats arise from the following: self-interest, doing something because you are going to profit from it in some way, not necessarily money, but maybe by promotion or something of that sort. Self-review, simply recognizing it's very difficult to recheck work you've done yourself, very, very dangerous. Familiarity is where you are, in a way, too friendly with people. Once you're too friendly with people, you begin to believe them. What accountants are supposed to have, really, is what's called professional skepticism. Now, professional skepticism, if you're a skeptic, it means you don't know. Okay? So professional skepticism means that you don't, let's say you're trying to get information to produce a cash flow forecast, and you go to the salespeople, you go to the purchases people, you go to the people who are going to be buying the non-current assets. You ask them for estimates of sales and costs and so on. It doesn't mean that you believe they're all out to give you wrong information. You don't believe the worst of everybody, but it means that you are aware that we're all subject to human frailty, that we're all subject maybe to optimism which isn't properly justified. So you go to the sales director and you know this person is probably inherently optimistic. And professional skepticism means knowing that, and not just taking maybe the figures the sales director has told you, but asking for some justification. Why do you think the sales next year are going to be 10% higher than the sales this year when the products are a bit old, and we've maybe been seeing a bit of a decline of the products this year? We also, as part of professional skepticism and kind of knowing about human frailty, we also know people make errors. They give you wrong information, it's just in error. So we need to kind of check it. in some way. We know we may have approached somebody when they're really busy and they give you a very quick answer without maybe thinking about it properly, because they feel they've got something more important to do. So professional skepticism is kind of walking a tightrope. You don't necessarily believe people are deliberately misleading you, though some will. Part of professional skepticism is being aware that some people will try to mislead you, but not everybody. But also, it doesn't mean that you simply accept what everybody tells you without any sort of querying. And what happens with familiarity, when you get to know somebody well, is that your professional skepticism tends to drop. It's much harder to be skeptical, be slightly doubting about a friend, maybe, and what they tell you, than maybe about a stranger. Advocacy means, if you think of an advocate in a court, it means somebody speaking for you, but speaking for you in a very kind of one-sided way. Speaking for you may be really more than the evidence would suggest. And finally, intimidation. We can all be threatened by intimidation. It doesn't mean necessarily physical intimidation, but it could be a threat over your job, a threat that you won't get a certain promotion or your pay rise will be hurt. These are all intimidatory threats, maybe to try to get you to produce a certain cash flow or to write off a certain amount which was lost and to conceal it amongst other expenses. Self-interest threats. Self-interest threats can come from the following reasons. We'll just give examples of these here. Sometimes they can be within the company you're actually working for. Quite often it would be if you were doing some sort of consultancy work for a client of some sort here. So if you own shares in a client and the client wants you to do some sort of cash flow forecast that it's going to show to the bank that it's going to get more finance for, then of course you want the company in which you own shares to be successful. So you'll give a very kind of optimistic cash forecast. It gets a nice big loan, etc., etc. The shares maybe go up. So the self-interest here is owning shares in a client, or indeed your employer. You want your employer to do well. So certainly if you're an auditor, I know CIMA people don't do auditing, but auditors are simply not allowed to own shares in any audit client, because the threat is regarded as being too great. Loans and guarantees. You're given a loan by your employer. And of course the risk is that if you don't do what the employer wants, the employer wants the loan back. Or there's a kind of inducement here. You get a loan from your employer that's maybe very generous. You pay 2% interest when the going rate is maybe 7% interest. If your employer is a bank, this will be okay because it's part of it's okay if you get a loan at normal interest rates. But if your employer, let's say, was a building company, and suddenly your employer says, well, I'll give you a loan of $20,000 at 2% interest if you do this, then you're getting this soft loan from a company that normally doesn't give loans. It's clearly in your self-interest, if you like, or trying to appeal to your self-interest. It's like a bribe, isn't it? You shouldn't do it. Gifts and hospitality. No one's going to worry particularly if let's say you're taken down to the local McDonald's and you're given a Big Mac to reward you for something or to talk over some business problem during that. But then, of course, it's a sliding scale. You go to better restaurants, you go to 3-star Michelin restaurants. Then you say, well, this 3-star Michelin restaurant is in the Caribbean. We're going to take you there for a week, of course, to recover from the jet lag. At some point, it becomes obviously essentially a bribe that's been given to you. The kind of rule is that if you really want the gift or really want the hospitality, if it's something worth having, then you're not allowed it. If it's something essentially of trivial value, like a key ring or a pen, nobody's going to worry about that. And then contingent rewards or fees. So, like, I'll pay you $10,000 if you produce me an ordinary cash flow forecast, but I'll pay you $20,000 if you produce me a very optimistic cash flow forecast. This is obviously interfering with your objectivity, and simply is not allowed. Self-review threats, decision to review and justify work you've done yourself. Nearly impossible. First of all, if you've made an error of principle in the original, you will repeat the same error of principle in the second. And the second point is that, we all think if I do something, I've probably got it right. It's quite hard to exercise almost professional skepticism on one's own work, and it's boring anyway to have to recheck your own work. So if you're asked to review your own budget, it's a waste of time, really. The person who should be reviewing the budget is a colleague who will question your assumptions, who will go through the arithmetic, who will look at the delays in getting money from customers and do a proper job. Familiarity threat, because of a close relationship. So obviously close family relationships can interfere. So you're doing some work as an accountant for your brother. You want your brother to do well. You want your brother's company to do well, and so on. You tend to give your brother the benefit of the doubt. The professional skepticism is gone. There's also, in some cases here, a self-interest threat. You don't want to fall out with your brother. And maybe even an intimidation threat. This is your big brother. And when you were little, your big brother always beat you up. And that kind of power relationship is still there a little bit when you're asked to do work for this familiar bully, if you like. Brothers, obviously a close relationship. What about your cousin? What about your third cousin once removed, whom you've never met before? That's quite. At what point in blood relations does it get so far? And there isn't an answer to this. There is not. It's not set out in kind of genetics where you need to be careful. Obviously, if I was doing work for my wife's company, there's a close relationship there, and it's one that's in law. But what would happen if I was doing work for my girlfriend's company? Not that I have a wife and a girlfriend, but there's no legal relationship, if you like, and of course just friends. And this often happens in kind of auditing contexts. You have the auditing partner, you have the finance director, both accountancy backgrounds, both probably about the same age. They get to that point when they're about 35. Maybe they have a young family each, and so they begin. The families see a little bit more of each other because the kids play well. And then they go on holidays together because, again, the kids play well, and the kids are happy, the parents are happy, and so on. And before long, you had something which started off as a non-familiar relationship, over time becomes more and more familiar, and it's going to be interfering with the quality of the work, or could be accused of interfering with the quality of the work. Because a lot of ethics is not about professional ethics, not about not being influenced, but being seen to be beyond reproach. You have to prove that there could be no ethical conflict. Advocacy, furthering your employer's cause aggressively, very one-sidedly, beyond reason, if you like, more than the evidence that you've seen would actually support. Of course, you're going to stick up for your employer, but you can't cross over that line where what you're really basing your advocacy on is a fiction, and you know it's a fiction. It is entirely unreasonable to say, yes, these are the sales which we are expecting. Intimidation threats where an accountant is deterred from acting properly because either of physical intimidation or intimidation, as I said, with regard to promotion or salary and so on, or maybe litigation and so on. We have to try to avoid it. We have to try to think, what should we do if it does actually arise? Then confidentiality. We should not disclose information to third parties without permission of a client or an employer, except if permitted or required by law, like money laundering. Permitted by law might be to do with public interest. Is quite a difficult area to do with public interest. What's in the public interest? So if you found your employer was paying staff below the legal minimum, you would probably be hard pressed to say that disclosing that is in the public interest. If, however, you discovered that your employer had concealed safety results, maybe on a new drug, and wasn't being open with the regulatory authorities about problems associated with this new drug, so people could actually be physically damaged or even be killed because of these side effects, then that, I think, would be pretty clearly within the public interest. There is no clear definition of what's in the public interest and what isn't, and this is where almost certainly what you would want to do, we'll see ways of dealing with ethical conflicts in a moment, but you would certainly talk to the employer, you can talk to CIMA, and you can talk to lawyers about whether or not, what action you should take, because it is not easy, it is not cut and dried. The approach to ethical conflicts, which we have and set up by CIMA, is this. So here you think you're being asked to do something which is unethical, being asked by your employer to do something which is unethical, maybe to be overly optimistic in a cash flow projection. The first thing you have to do is to make sure that of your facts. You could be wrong, of course. The employer's assumptions about sales and costs could be right. So we don't want to be making a fuss, if you like. You look stupid, it's going to hurt you. You make a fuss when it wasn't actually justified. So you have to be sure of your facts. You have to think of the ethical issues involved, like integrity, objectivity, confidentiality, and so on. And there's often a conflict in here between maybe confidentiality and raising the point that you think something is unethical. You have to think, is it legal? Is it ethical? Is it legal? And you want to identify which fundamental principles are affected. Am I concealing money laundering? Am I concealing bribes? It may be legal, but am I being over-optimistic in sales? Am I being unfair to potential investors in the company by concealing some costs or some fraud which has occurred within the company? Where are the fundamental principles that I'm going to be applying to? And it's these 5 fundamental principles you really need to be looking at. You want to identify the affected parties. Who's going to be hurt by this? Who's going to be benefited by it? If somebody's hurt by it, how much are they going to be hurt by? How serious is this? Or is it just part of, the normal risk that we all undertake if we invest money in a company, for example? The first thing that you will look at is internal reporting. Report to a manager, report further up. Some companies now have ethics committees. They may have audit committees and so on. Some people have mentors that you can go and talk to people for advice. So maybe you talk to your manager and your manager thinks, and maybe explains to you why he or she doesn't think this is very important, but still fundamentally you believe there's a problem here. Then there needs to be some method of escalating it within the company. And then what we have to do is maybe think of external escalation, going outside the organization. This can involve here whistleblowing. Whistleblowing is going to the authorities, going directly to the authorities, the police, for example, and saying, look, this is what this company is doing, and maybe going to newspapers and so on. There is in the UK certain protection against whistleblowing in certain circumstances. So if you're doing it because somebody's going to be physically hurt, it's kind of permitted, but you have to do it in good faith. You can't do it just to get your own back on your boss, whom you don't like. So to know whether something is worthy, will be protected in this whistleblowing, whether the confidentiality rules that you're operating under would permit you to do it, you have to seek professional or legal advice. The professional advice would be from CIMA, legal advice would be from a lawyer. And if it's still not resolved and you still feel that what you've been asked to do is wrong, or what the company is doing is wrong, and you have not been convinced by anyone that you're wrong and they're right, then what you should do is to refuse to remain or be associated with this conflict. And that may mean resigning. Or just say, I'm not going to do it. And then, of course, you risk disciplinary action and maybe ultimately the sack. And this is something which obviously is easier said than done. You know, this is your employer, you need the salary, you're supporting a family. But the ethical stance would be, if something is serious enough and you still believe you are right, is that you should resign or in some way remove yourself from this conflict.